Okay, welcome to Dis and Dat. I think it's 23 April 2025. Um, I pronounce Paul Cockshott as uh, as Cockshott just simply because otherwise people giggle too much. Um, Although I think it is Cockshott, uh, as if there were a U there or something. Anyway, Cockshott teaches at the university. He's a reader at the University of Glasgow in computer science. His which he does both computer science and economics. Undergrad is in economics, and a useful combination because he is one of the few people who sort of worked out, as have people like Anwar Sheikh, etc., the issue of whether the labor theory of value has any validity. And he, as well as people like Anwar Sheikh, have shown that it's actually pretty close. And that's what I'm going to do today is to convince you. I have mentioned him before in the same context. That is, it's possible to see the empirical value of a labor theory of value or labor theories of value. Needless to say, one can't just stop there and say, well, Marx was right. That's just not the point. The point of it is, of course, to simply allow for you know, the falsifiability of the research and to show that Marx wasn't just making stuff up. But I think one of the conditions, of course, of that is the issue of if you mention Marx at all or anything that looks like Marx on your CV, you get in trouble, at least in the Anglo-American context. In other contexts, it's less of a problem. Well, it depends where you are, I suppose. Of course, the penalties are probably worse in some places, and in other places, much better. So that's the sort of deal we sort of make. And so the article is an intersection of several other articles, sadly to say, but it is about sort of discussing David Harvey's issues with the labor theory of value, as well as Michael Roberts. And yes, it is a critique of David Harvey, and David Harvey's response and the usual academic stuff. But I've mentioned this before, and I may have even used part of this article before. But today is a much more complete version, and on this particular printing or posting, I've included the math. Also, the math that's fairly current, where Cockshott is now, where Paul is now. He's not one of the two Pauls. He's the third Paul, as it were. Um, and where he's discussing sort of non-Euclidean stuff and a bunch of other things. There is math, but you don't. I'm not going to talk about math today, but I've included three videos that are, yes, math, for those who want to pursue it further, because I think that's actually important to know that this math exists, and it has existed. It's just that if you're in certain types of econ departments, this just wouldn't come up, or it would come up and then people would get nervous or something. It's not dangerous math, it's just math. And similarly, I think when you look at the empirical work, it's not as problematic as one would think, even though you have to sort of wage this weird ideological struggle that is a residual from the Red Scare, Red Square. Anyway, so I've included three videos, one called Value Form 2, one called Rubin Value and Forms Part 1, because, and I think he just put this one out very recently because people were being annoying. He was getting trolled by people, trolled by Marxists. So, because I think he made some comment about Rubin's work, and some people took offense to that because it is sort of with respect, a certain quasi-orthodox text, and of course, people just whatever. There are people who just like arguing, I suppose. And of course, an earlier work by Cockshott is Why Labor Theory of Value is Right. This is an older piece, but it does the same thing. So anyway, I've included several different things, including this long post, which includes the David Harvey and Michael Roberts thing. And I hopefully will get to the end of that today. I think I tacked something else on at the end. I can't remember now. But needless to say, I've there's a lot here. Oh yes, diagrams. The point that he's going to be making, and so you won't get too terribly lost, is a question about what counts as abstract labor, which is what I've been yammering about for a couple of weeks now. And I've showed this diagram before. It's readily available. Um, Hopefully it shows the parallelism of different kinds of, on the one hand, concrete labor, but the fact is that the abstract labor is more similar in the sense that reality, of course, has, and our problem, of course, with reality is that, there are forms of appearance and which are usable. They give us value, they give us pleasure in some ways. And so you could say that there's abstract labor, A and B, value, A and B. They're not identical. They're just, that's the world. And the form of appearance issue comes back when we consider the Marxian question, and that is the commodity, which in the David Harvey sense only becomes this or tends to become this. And this is where the argument gets a little fuzzy among these three guys. I mean, I don't think there's any problem with it because from a, you know, if you think structurally, there's no real problem with it. But some people take offense and they have issues. You're attacking the working class. You're not acknowledging class struggle, blah, blah, blah. Um, and none of those apply. All it is a commentary on the relation between commodities, exchange value, and use value. And it's essentially those three things: use value as value, and commodities, of course, but exchange value. So there's a kind of weird triangularity among those terms. Now, everybody's diagrams get all messed up because people go, okay, capital starts with commodity. You talk about use value and exchange value. You reconcile it as value. Ultimately, that can become surplus. It's not identified here, but you identify the fact that it is, as we've looked at in various things that I've yammered at you about, what counts as socially necessary labor time, because it is, of course, social. And it consists of concrete, as we looked at in the diagram above, concrete and abstract labor becomes realized in exchange. Now, that's the question of how realized does it get, or does realized this kind of, it happens, it gets ablated, whatever you may want to refer to it as, and it has both relative elements and equivalent elements if you think dialectically. And then ultimately, in the big diagram that I've showed before, that is a Harvey diagram, um, you know, the money commodity occurs. In other words, you start with commodity and then you get more abstract in one sense. You successively abstract ideas become integrated and you get to the money commodity and then you get to money. I'll show that in a second. And the business that we fiddled around with in volume one is the difference. You talk about a working day. There's an absolute surplus value or way in which you can think about the whole thing. And then within it, so it's external and internal. And internally, you can think about the focus of surplus value as a proportion to or function of necessary value, which is talking about, you can get people to work faster, harder, more intensely, blah, 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 blah. And that's how surplus value is generated within a working day. And outside of the working days, of course, you increase the time, right? You just make the working day longer. Double shifts, triple shifts, etc. So the point is that surplus value comes of this, but as in the above diagram, I just talked about necessary value, which consists of course, labor, the actual labor itself, right? But you also have ways in which you characterize it, and that is, of course, labor power, the kind of expectations about the physical activity of working labor. But you also have the equivalence that exists simultaneous to, you're just sitting there slugging away, but you're dealing with both things as a kind of necessary part of the value. You got to go to work, you got to punch in, you got to punch out, and all of those things have an exchange value, and from that, capitalists derive surplus value from the sets of things there. You don't have to, it's not like you've got to get a stopwatch out. And in fact, the stopwatches are problematic even in that context. You'd have to have several types of stopwatches. Anyway, similarly, the general basic equation of MCM, right? MCM prime, which is, calculus wise, that's the change. That's, how you get more money. Why does capitalism work? It is because it has the money commodity used in commodity production, combines labor power and means of production, which is both constant and variable capital. You get the production of more commodities, which is part of this whole circuit of, cycle of progress, C prime, and more money ultimately because you've put it into a market and because it's a commodity, blah 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 blah, and you get more money and et cetera, and then it comes back, not identically. And as I've described, for those who will review what is looked at in volume 2, you can see there's a difference between, but it exists in the same moment, variable and constant capital, that it has a production element, Department 1. You have a commodities component or a consumptive component in the circuit that is that helps generate a necessary value and surplus value. You can see how surplus value gets recycled back into necessary labor and means of production, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how capital expands, which is volume 2. And this is the Harvey path of argument. You start with commodity, use, exchange, values, socially. You see it comes all back to the same general sets of diagrams. And to critique David Harvey is not to negate or eradicate this conception. This is just it's a schematic, but it helps explain this stuff. That is, exchange value is important. That concrete labor and abstract labor is a form of value. There is equivalent and relative form, just like as we discussed above. Money form, the money form, you go down to the second row, and it defines social relations and material relations, which are not identical. And this focuses on the Harvey emphasis on market exchange and the differentiation between those who sell stuff and those who buy stuff, because it's a property relation, and of course the money commodity. Um, as in a further abstraction, it's a measure of value and a medium of circulation because both are there in the use of money in terms of commodity. And so then you get the money form, of course, and then you have money, actual money in the big money, um, which in an economy is debtors and creditors. That's all you got. Um, you're either one or the other. And then, of course, because you have this system, it becomes capital. This is the Harvey position. And you have value in process, which has equivalences and non-equivalences, which resemble, and they're not identical, they resemble paid and unpaid labor. This is where you can resolve the paid unpaid labor problem, that have to do with, of course, surplus value, and then the issue, the fundamental issue, which goes all the way back to the differences among labor, is the buying and selling of labor power, and of course the bifurcation into capital and labor, and then ultimately the argument, which some people always argue with heterodox Marxists, or orthodox and heterodox Marxists have a tendency to complain about that particular issue about doing capital and labor, which is ultimately that issue brought up even by artificial intelligence, and that is class struggle. So we begin with Cockshott's linear plot of market value against alternative value bases, 1998. The point of this, of course, is to show that actual official data can be used in a labor theory of value model. Seems absurd that one has to answer this question. It was so thoroughly answered by previous generations of economists in the affirmative that it would seem unnecessary even to examine the issue. But David Harvey has recently posted a short article claiming that Marx was an opponent of the labor theory. Now, just before we go into this, the issue is the same as we looked at a couple days ago, and that is, what is the difference between whether you accept Marx's. Remember, Marx is doing a critique, so he's doing a critique of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. So the idea is, if you're building a critique, you have to sort of take on what they've got and sort of say, well, that's not quite it, or I accept some of these things, or some of these things are kind of a worthy idea, and then I'm going to move in a different direction, which is what Marx does with the dialectic and producing dialectical materialism. It's widely believed that Marx adapted the labor theory of value from Ricardo as a founding concept for his studies of capital accumulation. Since the labor theory of value has been generally discredited, it is then often authoritatively stated that Marx's theories are worthless. But nowhere, in fact, did Marx declare his allegiance to the labor theory of value. That's the most important element because, this is why you could say that time got wasted in neo-Ricardianism, but well, whatever. That theory belonged to Ricardo, who recognized that it was deeply problematic, even if he insisted that the question of value was critical to the study of political economy. On the few occasions where Marx comments directly on this matter, he refers to value theory and not to the labor theory of value. So that is important as well. So what then was Marx's distinctive value theory, and how does it differ from the labor theory of value? This is the issue that comes all the way up into stuff like Heinrich talking about the value form. It is difficult to take this seriously, but as Mike Roberts has done a reply, I probably should do likewise and type a brief response. This is Cockshott writing here, right? David Harvey, claims that the labor theory of value is generally discredited, but in what sense? Now, it's correct to say that the theory is not viewed with favor in economics departments, but that is for political reasons. The labor theory of value since Gray and Marx came to be associated with, yes, socialism, since academic economists in general did not want to be tainted with the socialist label. Thank you, Red Scare. They were at pains to distance themselves from the theory, but none of them ever adduced any empirical evidence to refute it. It was socially discredited, but not empirically refuted. Now, if one wants to refute a theory about the world, you have to show that the theory makes incorrect empirical predictions. And that's the issue. And you'll actually see in current literature about complaining about the lack of predictive value of, certain heterodox theories. Eratosthenes refuted the theory that the Earth was flat and confirmed the theory that it is round by observing that when the sun was overhead in Cyrene, it was at an angle of 7 degrees 12 minutes to the vertical in Alexandria, implying that the Earth was curved with a circumference of 25,000 miles. If the Earth had been flat, the angle of the sun would not have varied as you went north. Now, that's just there and is pretty empirical if, the Greeks were worried about that, but yet we still, of course, there's still ignorant people who believe, have this flat earth thing, partially because it just makes people's heads explode, I suppose. And that may be the only reason why they even attempt to say that to pretend that they believe it. All right, back to Earth. The labor theory of value predicts that the prices of commodities will vary proportionately with their labor content. Refuting this should be easy. Just show that, in fact, the prices do not vary with labor content in this way. Did the economists opposed to the labor theory of value do this? Well, did they? Hell, they did not even bother to collect the data to do the tests. So, for a century after Marx, the theory was discredited, but never empirically refuted. This is the important issue because it got tainted, of course, because, well, revolutionaries believe this stuff. And, that you can just see that it was at least empirically speaking, an unfair bias. Now, as soon as economists started to collect data to test the theory, which depended on reasonably good economic statistics of whole economy, so it's a big data problem, what did they find? They found that Ricardo and Marx had been right all along. A whole bunch of studies, and there are a lot of links there, since the 1980s, since the Reagan era and Thatcher, have shown that the labor theory of value is actually very good at predicting prices. Far from being refuted by the evidence, it has been confirmed. Harvey is like a flat earther after Eratosthenes denying the earth is round on theological grounds. So this is, where it breaks again. It is, perhaps a trivial argument and much internal to Marxist economics or to heterodox economics, but one just has to say, well, it's still there, and you sort of need to figure out your position on this, even though there's some empirical proof. Harvey next complains that Marx nowhere declares his allegiance to the labor theory of value. True enough, since at the time Marx was writing, that was the only theory going, which is true. It simply was the theory of value. It was only afterward that the alternative marginal utility or neoclassical theory of value was established. Actually, they're sort of working at the same time. That is, in the latter half of Marx's life, it was generally parallel to the development of marginal utility theory. After Jevons, economists distinguished between the classical or labor theory of value and the neoclassical or marginalist theory of value, and that's where it always comes back. The recovery of the left model is to appeal to the fact that Marx is making a critique of classical political economy, so therefore, he's in the classical period from a periodistic point of view, as opposed to neoclassical. So it's simple periodicity, and yes, no one continues to do classical economics, except that you could argue, and this is where Austrians come in, amongst others, is that there is some sort of demand by Austrians that it is, you still need to study classical. But anyway, it is ridiculous to expect Marx to have taken sides in a debate that only started after Capital was published. Well, actually, it's pretty obvious. At the time he was writing it, it was widely accepted that labor was the source of value. Even Jevons, the founder of marginalism, still accepted that prices were proportional to labor, thinking that his marginal utility theory gave further support to this time-honored assumption. And yes, that neoclassicism still uses it, at least in the basic text, but tends to leave labor economics behind in its wake for a variety of reasons. Harvey promises to explain what Marx's theory of value actually is, but nowhere in his article does he do this. That is because it would be impossible to do this without revealing that the theory of value in Marx is identical in all major predictions to that of Ricardo. Now, what did Ricardo's theory say, and did Marx agree with him? When comparing theorists, especially ones who originally wrote in distinct languages, you should not pay too much attention to the precise vocabulary that they use. This is that translation problem that we've been fiddling with. What is important is the relations between the concepts they deploy and the relationships that the theorists predict will hold in the real world. When you look at this, you see that Marx followed Ricardo's value theory very closely. Now, there are four key components to their value theory on which both authors agree. Number one, the exchangeable value of commodities varies with their direct labor content. Number two, the indirect labor used to make raw materials and equipment also contribute proportionately to the exchange value. This is not controversial. Number three, it is the labor actually expended, not the level of pay of the workers, that determines value. That's the difficult problem for a lot of people. And number four, the variation of price with labor will be modified by the formation of an equal rate of profit on stock. This is where, this is the commodity problem in some ways. The theories are therefore substantially identical in the empirical predictions they make, differing only slightly in terminology, points 1, 2, and 3. are validated by the empirical data in the studies cited earlier. Point 4 is poorly supported by or refuted by the empirical data. That's, the stock flow questions are still actually very important. Marx and Ricardo say the same thing where they're both right, and they say the same things where they're both wrong. That's probably a key point. Problematic for neo-Ricardians. So yes, Marx has a labor theory of value, as Ricardo had. The greater part of this theory is not refuted by the evidence. It is confirmed by it. Now, this does not mean that Marx made no contributions. He's not simply a Ricardian in that sense. Major innovations in Marx's thought were, number one, the point that labor only gets represented as exchange value in societies with private ownership and atomized production. Marx says exchange was absent in traditional Indian communities or the communism of the Incas. This is why we talk about, primitive accumulation still. The prior economists had assumed that all societies produce commodities, so that's just not true. I mean, this is why Marx was concerned with anthropology. Number two, the distinction between labor and labor power, and that's the move to abstraction, to creating a more abstract way in which to generalize further certain particular elements is actually really important and shows that Marx was moving in a quote unquote scientific direction. Number three, the introduction of the concept of surplus value as something functionally prior to the division of surplus value between profit, interest, and rent. And we saw this mentioned, in other stuff that I've mentioned earlier or read earlier, sort of pre-capitalist in that sense, and that's even problematic. Number four, I guess we're at number four, a new theory to explain the falling rate of profit. 5, a repudiation of Say's law. 6, the concept of absolute ground rent, which, of course, as we've seen with certain post-Keynesians or, neo-Marxists, or whatever you want to call them, they've, throw out absolute ground rent for a variety of reasons, which may or may not be good. 6, the introduction of more modes of production than the ones Adam Smith recognized. That's, Marx tries to show, well, it's kind of cyclic. You move from primitive communism to feudalism to, to mercantilism, and then to capitalism, and then to socialism, and then ultimately to communism again, advanced as opposed to primitive communism. All right. And I left out slavery there, right? Primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism, whatever. These are all significant innovations that did distinguish him from his predecessors. There's no need to pretend innovation by Marx in value theory, a topic where he just rigorously used Ricardo's concepts. Now, what about abstract or concrete labor? Was this distinction not an innovation on Marx's part? Well, the specific phrase, concrete labor, was different, but the relative conceptual distinction between the two was already present in Adam Smith's work. Smith simply uses the term labor unqualified, where Marx sometimes says abstract labor. Smith specifically says that when he's talking about labor in this way, he is talking about labor in the abstract. When Smith discusses the division of labor, he's discussing the division of the abstract labor into what he terms varieties of labor or sorts of labor. See, gets all crazy philological, but this is actually the point of doing this exercise. This is the same distinction that Marx is making when, using the slightly different term, he talks of abstracting from concrete labors or kinds of labor. So in tabular form, and yes, we love tabular form, but you can see that, it's abstract has these multiple ways in which you can refer to it, that Marx talking about concrete. Smith is talking about, that it is a kind, but it also is palpable to Smith, and that it has variety, whereas Marx is just simply talking about the kind of labor that it is without talking about these other attributes, and that it is concrete. And so, there's just more stuff that Smith talks about. And of course, there's labor, and it's talked about in the abstract, but Marx moves slightly further forward and says, well, there's a thing that is labor, not just in the abstract, but as a concept. So the same conceptual distinction is being made here between the different kinds of activities into which the labor is divided, and labor in the abstract or the abstract notion of labor. So structurally speaking, you have this, it's kind of bifurcated or dichotomized. So that's the point of Cockshott's little thing, but he has a huge footnote here that is a useful footnote, um, and is a Marxian footnote on explaining that further. So you can read that at your leisure. And so, as you can see, the footnotes are actually longer than the article itself. Now, as I said, several articles, and this is where the math comes, but you don't have to read the math, and we're not testing anyone. So, but you can see kind of where he's going, and why he does what he does. He just doesn't make this crap up. And the problem, of course, is many other people who make up all kinds of, who configure or conceptualize a whole bunch of other reasons and, empirical explanations on the basis of textual interpretation, lack the precision that at least framing it in math allows us to talk about the logical questions. And of course, this is a logic that seems even more coherent once you start talking about Hegel. Now, Hegel's math, that's probably a whole nother set of issues. But anyway, but it is a tradition of thinking that is not wholly problematic. And it's not like we're all going back to Ptolemy or something. Anyway, Marx's Law of Value, a debate between David Harvey and Michael Roberts. Now, so here we go. This is Cockshott talking about two other people who are pretty good and pretty interesting to read still, David Harvey and Michael Roberts. The difference between Harvey and Roberts is, of course, Harvey has been an academic and comes from economic geography, and so he has a whole set of other issues. Michael Roberts, worked in the city, so he has he knows how to do all the financial stuff. So there's all kinds of things coming together from all these different people. And of course, Cockshott, because he's a computer science person, among many other things, this has an interesting, sort of interaction or overlap. This is going to be a long post, so bear with me. I'll get to some point in this and probably stop because I'm close to the end. First, you'll have to read a paper attached below by Professor David Harvey, then a critique by me, Cockshott, below, and finally a reply to my critique by Professor Harvey. And then it's up to you readers to see what you make of it. This is like a medieval religious debate about how many angels there are on the head of a pin. Or is it a debate that leads to something really worth knowing? Well, it could be, not so much the head of the pin, but the tail end of a needle. And, we're trying to force camels through it. Anyway, David Harvey's misunderstanding of Marx's law of value. This is the Roberts position, I suppose. Recently, Professor David Harvey, DH, sent out an email to several people, including me, attaching a short paper for discussion. That's the Harvey paper linked. The paper outlines David Harvey's view that Marx's theory of value in capitalist economies has been badly misunderstood. And so the thing I read at the beginning is a sort of answer to that. Just in case you're unaware, difficult to believe, Professor Harvey is probably the most eminent Marxist scholar alive, with a host of books, papers, and educational videos to his name on Marxist economic theory. And we've looked at that before a couple of years ago. Now, yes, it has been a couple of years. The short paper circulated expressed succinctly his view of Marx's value theory that is recently outlined more expansively in his latest book, Marx, Capital and the Madness of Economic Reason, which we haven't covered here yet. And I think that we'll probably do that at some moment, among other things that we're going to cover tomorrow. For example, we're going to cover I think the preface and the prologue to a book written in the 1980s on the formation of communist work groups, among other things. It's about unequal exchange. And this is because our friend Henry Hakamaki has provided a little front end to this thing that is being reproduced by Iskar Books. In the paper, now back to the text, entitled Marx's Refusal of the Labor Theory of Value, David Harvey, DH, argues that Marx did not have a labor theory of value at all. His theory of value was distinctive from that of the classical economist David Ricardo. Now, that's actually, you can argue that point. Instead, according to David Harvey, Marx argued that value was a reflection. Now, that's where we can go to Lenin on that. That value was a reflection of labor embodied in a commodity which is only created or revealed in exchange in the market. As DH puts it, if there is no market, there is no value. Now, if this is correct, then it is in the realization of value as expressed in money that value emerges, not in the production process as such. Let me stop there and say this is a crux of arguments among Marxists. I mean, some have got issues. Is it here or there? Is it in both places? Fortunately, it's only, you were only trying to decide between two things, but even that is problematic. Okay, back to text. DH then goes on to argue that if wages are forced down to the minimum or even to nothing, then there will be no market for commodities and thus no value. And this is the real root of capitalist crises. And thus it follows that a policy for capital to avoid crises would be by raising wages to ensure rational consumption from the standpoint of capital and colonizing everyday life as a field for consumerism. This is a very big argument and one subscribed to by a bunch of folks. This is the consequence of a correct view of Marx's value theory, according to DH. DH points out that this interpretation of value theory is far beyond what Ricardo had in mind and equally far away from the conception of value usually attributed to Marx. Yes, it certainly is. But is DH right in his interpretation of Marx's value theory? And even if he is, does such interpretation have any empirical validity? I would answer, and this is Cockshott, I would answer both these questions with no, none, nine, to use Marx's three best-known languages. DH starts by saying, quote, it is widely believed that Marx adapted the labor theory of value from Ricardo as a founding concept for his studies of capital accumulation. And, quote, since the labor theory of value has been generally discredited, it is often authoritatively stated that Marx's theories are worthless, unquote. Now, it's not clear to whom DH is referring to. Clearly, bourgeois mainstream economists consider Marx's law of value as discredited. The neoclassical marginalists have long rejected the concept of labor value by labeling it metaphysical. And yes, that critique is widely shared. Neo-Ricardian, post-Straussian, and post-Keynesian economists, in particular, and this is the interesting problem, are also strongly inclined to dismiss any notion of value as an ideological mystification. So you can see this is kind of a doubled discrediting. For a variety of reasons. It's safer. Those of us who recall Kamala Harris running for president, her father was a post-Straussian or a neo-Ricardian, even though he talked about Marx a heck of a lot. It's just safer for him to talk about it in those terms and in development terms, in post-Keynesian terms, because he was at Stanford. Anyway, but most Marxist economists are aware of the distinction between Marx's value theory and Ricardo's, and the difference is not what Harvey says it is. Namely, Ricardo had a labor theory of value and Marx did not. The difference is that Ricardo had a theory of use value based on concrete labor, that is, the physical amounts of labor, measured in labor time. Marx's law of value was based not on the physical amounts of labor measured in labor time, but on abstract labor, that is, value measured in labor time when socially tested on the market. So, in other words, if you were going to, yammer about labor power, that's what you'll be doing. That's the advantage of talking about labor power, is that you're not talking about the specific day on the job, but you're talking about something a little bit more complex. And you can see that, right? The difference between necessary value and surplus value at one level. Under capitalism, human labor power itself is a commodity to be sold on the market. Indeed, this is a key characteristic of the capitalist mode of production, where the majority has no means of production and so must sell their labor power to the owners of the means of production. So, just as with other commodities, labor has a dual property. On the one hand, it is useful labor, that is, expenditure of human labor in a concrete form and for a specific purpose, and with this property creates use values. On the other hand, it is abstract labor, that is, expenditure of human labor power without specific characteristics which creates the value of the commodity in which it is represented. Thus, Marx made the distinction between labor and labor power, a distinction that is absolutely crucial for the understanding of the source of profit. This was the great advance in Marx's law of value. The labor time embodied in the commodities normally purchased by the worker for the reproduction of himself and his family in a day is less than the labor time that a worker actually offers to the owner of the capital during the same time period. The result is that for any given time period, the worker produces more value than the wage equivalent which is paid by the owner of capital for the use of the labor power. This difference Marx calls unpaid labor and surplus labor or surplus value. So they're all the same. Marx's value theory of abstract labor exposes the exploitative nature of the capitalist mode of production, while neither Ricardo's nor Adam Smith's labor theory of value does. So this move to abstraction, right, to create this concept, this unit called labor power, is that difference that Marx provides. And it has labor implied, but it's not in and of itself labor. So that's the kind of interesting, it's it's in the midst of sublation or whatever. DH mentions just once and in passing this vital discovery of Marx, i.e., abstract labor, that distinguishes Marx's law from the classical labor theory of value, and that is because Harvey wants to press on to his interpretation of Marx's theory as one where value is created/realized only in exchange and not in the process of production using labor power. So that's an important difference. It's not one and two, it's two only, or something. DH says that, quote, value is initially taken to be a reflection, see this Lenin again, of the social abstract labor congealed in commodities. But, quote, as a regulatory form in the marketplace, value can exist, Marx shows, only when and where commodity exchange has become a, quote, normal social act. So, without money, there's no value. This is that a connection or problematic connection where, you're trying to explain unpaid stuff and, you still require money to kind of measure it, whatever that means. Yes, but the value of a commodity is still the labor contained in it and expanded during the production process before it gets to market. Value is expended physical and mental human labor, which is then abstracted by the social process of production for the market. Value is not a creature of money. On the contrary, money is the representation or exchange value of labor expended, but not vice versa. Now, that's arguable, certainly. I think Marx is clear on this crucial point. He says in Capital Volume 1, quote, the value of a commodity is expressed in its price before it enters into circulation, and it is therefore a precondition of circulation, not its result. Murray Smith, in his new and forthcoming edition of his book, Invisible Leviathan, yes, we've got to get to that too, provides a concise explanation of the difference between Marx's law of value and David Harvey's interpretation. Marx said that, quote, money as the measure of value is a necessary form of appearance of the measure of value which is imminent, remember that, imminent, in commodities, namely labor time, unquote. Smith comments that this, quote, is certainly inconsistent with the idea that value can be created in the act of exchange. It is precisely because exchange effects a process of, quote, equalization of products of labor on the market, unquote, that is, involves a real abstraction, that production oriented towards exchange must take account of the fact that physiological labor is both utility shaping and value creating. That is, both concrete and abstract at one and the same time. Now, that value is created not in production, but at the articulation of production and circulation, is a notion replete with circular reasoning and requiring the most robust of mental gymnastics to entertain. The problem with this approach is that if one accepts that abstract associated labor has no substantial existence apart from the value form, comma, money, comma, right? This is where the value form argument goes. Then commodity values appear to be severed entirely from any determination in the conditions of their production, and the way is paved for an effective identification of value and price, unquote. Now, instead, Marx's law of value is based on the view that the labor involved in the production of commodities produces value, while exchange realizes it in money form. Seems pretty simple. It's only because of this that Marx can distinguish between the amounts of value and surplus value created in commodity production and the generally different amounts realized through exchange. See, it is a matter of emphasis, but the emphasis for some people is it's a hill some people want to die on. Contrary to the view of the mainstream and neo-Ricardian economists, there is no mystification here. Value is objective and real, and not just expressed in money. Marx's law of value, where abstract labor measured in labor time explains exchange value and prices and can be empirically validated. Now, that's an interesting point and worth getting into an argument about. There's reason behind Harvey's interpretation. If value is created only at the moment of exchange for money and money rules, then it will be effective demand. This is a fundamental argument. This is the problem between Mosley and Heinrich. Then it will be effective demand that will decide whether capitalism smoothly accumulates without recurrent crises. Now, to show this, Harvey describes in some detail the impact of capitalist accumulation on the conditions and living standards as capitalists strive to raise relative surplus value through the introduction of machinery. This is where the globalization argument goes. He uses some of the graphic examples provided Marx in chapter 25 of volume 1. Chapter 25 is always going to come back to us because it is kind of a key moment in volume 1 of Capital, which is what we're going to look at in the 2024 edition. Harvey emphasizes that capitalist accumulation aims to minimize the value of labor power, even to the point of pauperism. Okay, I'm close to the end here. I'm clearly not at the end of the article. It just rumbles on and is about essentially this pivotal argument. And yes, David Harvey responds to to Cockshott and Roberts, and it gets a little ugly. Well, not ugly. It's just it is about the kind of adumbration of terms. What do you agree that what is exchange? What is a market exchange? Are market exchanges the same as non-market exchanges? Because there are non-market exchanges, but that's a whole another thing. Maybe we can talk about this at some other moment. I probably will. And so you should think about this little piece here. I will, of course, refer to it again. And it does have the general problem, I think the front end problem of what are always the problems of discussing that in an academic context. People have issues and they pop up and, it's a matter of trying to work through this. Now, there's a note here, note 4, as I've indicated, and it refers to what Cottrell and Cockshott have kind of worked out in terms of data, and that kind of answers the question. And so the fundamental argument about mystification and other stuff, it really should fall by the wayside. But in fact, with all due respect, people just reproduce this conflict without sort of working it through. Because at one level, it's easier to explain. That is, well, it's obvious that there's a working class, and it's obvious that there are capitalists, and of course, there's a bourgeoisie who, there's other issues there. And then you have the PMC, there are other things, and there's labor aristocracy and a whole bunch of other things that make you think, well, it must be, either out of date, or else you have to devote um, a kind of slavish, commitment to the idea from an ideological point of view, and not consider that, well, actually the numbers sort of work, so you should sort of relax. But that's not where some people go. Okay, that's all I have to yammer about because I've exceeded my time. Uh, the question is, at what point did we decide that managers should earn more than the actual productive workers? Yes, indeed. That's a point that Marx brings up. He's kind of skeptical about what that might mean. And um, it's stuff he wanted to work out further along the line, but he never quite works through it. But he does see that, who gets more out of this. And so this circles back around to exploitation. The people who get the stuff make up the he who has enough gold, whatever, etc. What Trump quoted the other day from the Wizard of Id. And then when did we decide that CEOs should earn hundreds of times more than the people actually making the products? Well, it's because of power, right? It's because they're in charge. But as we realize, once they actually start talking, and this is the advantage of people, CEOs think that if you personalize the discourse, that they will you'll convince the workers that they're just like us, but they're not. And they reveal that when they start yakking about as being benevolent CEOs, because they aren't. um, and I think we've seen that in its most extreme version in the recent election. And of course, you could even use a whole Marxian analysis about why Elon's going back to stuff. But anyway, going back to Tesla, sort of. Anyway, that's we're going to end the live stream so we can get back to a real, actual commentary. Um, Thank you for your attention. And there's more happening tonight. There is in the spirituality and activism, there's a discussion of Il Papa, the late Pope, which is important because I think that you'll see the contrast, not unlike the contrast we saw between Francis and Benedict. We'll see that contrast coming up with, quote unquote, the next